You're standing in the parking lot of a car dealership on a Saturday afternoon, keys to your own 9-year-old sedan still in your hand, watching a salesman circle a loaner vehicle with the enthusiasm of someone who's already decided you're going to buy it, when your phone buzzes with a message from your financial advisor confirming a wire that closed that morning. A private placement, 7 figures, the kind of transaction that used to feel significant and now registers with roughly the same emotional weight as a grocery receipt. You put the phone back in your pocket and tell the salesman you're just looking today, which is true, and drive home in the same sedan you arrived in, the check engine light flickering on and off the way it's done for the better part of a year over a sensor nobody's gotten around to replacing because it's never once affected how the car actually runs. Your net worth crossed 8 figures 14 months ago. Nobody at that dealership had any way of knowing that, standing there in a golf shirt with a receipt for a fill-up from the gas station down the street folded in his back pocket. There was no version of that Saturday where the number in your accounts and the car in your driveway had anything meaningful to do with each other, and there never has been, for longer than the number's been large enough to matter to anyone but you. Nobody throws a parade for the purchase that never happens. There's no ceremony for the car you didn't buy, the boat you never priced out, the vacation home you toured once and quietly decided against. The decisions just accumulate year after year, invisible to everyone except the balance sheet they're slowly protecting. The levels don't feel like levels when you're inside them. Everything eventually just becomes Saturday. Your business partner Aurelio hit a comparable milestone around the same time you did, an earnout from the same company sale finally clearing escrow, and he handled it the opposite way, immediately and visibly, in a manner that's reshaped the last 14 months of his life. He bought the boat within the first month, not a modest one, the kind with a flybridge and a crew cabin, purchased at a marina 2 hours from where he actually lives, a decision he described at the time as something I've always wanted, a sentence that turned out to mean he'd wanted it the way people want things they've seen in photographs rather than things they've actually thought through the maintenance schedule for. Within the same year, there was a second home on a lake he visits perhaps 6 weekends annually, a membership at a club he's used 4 times, and a habit of upgrading to first class on every flight regardless of length, a habit he describes as just how I fly now, the way people describe a preference that's quietly become an obligation. Aurelio financed the boat over a payment plan he mentions only reluctantly when it comes up, along with a mortgage on the lake house, sized to an income he's assuming will keep arriving at the same pace it has for the last several years. He tells you this over lunch, unprompted, the way people tell you things they've rehearsed the explanation for. He says the boat is basically nothing against what we made on the sale, which is a sentence people only say about a sale they've stopped treating as a single event and started treating as a permanent new floor under everything else. The boat costs $340,000, plus a slip fee, plus maintenance that runs, by his own admission, close to $40,000 a year, whether he uses it 6 times or 60. Against the actual return his invested capital could otherwise be generating. That boat isn't dollars. It's the compounding difference between a portfolio that keeps growing and one that's permanently smaller by the exact amount required to keep an asset afloat, literally, for a handful of weekends a year. He calls it enjoying the money instead of just watching it sit there. The money was never just sitting there, it was working, quietly, the entire time, right up until a portion of it got redirected into something that depreciates the moment it leaves the dealer's water. This is the first quiet truth underneath everything that follows. The purchases rich people avoid aren't avoided out of austerity. They're avoided because each one represents a specific, calculable trade against the compounding that created the wealth in the first place. And once you've watched that compounding operate for long enough, every purchase starts to look less like a reward and more like a withdrawal from the one mechanism actually generating the number people are trying to enjoy. At the same lunch, Aurelio asks if you've thought about getting a boat of your own, now that the deal's cleared, half joking, gesturing at the general idea of celebration neither of you has fully indulged in yet. You tell him you've thought about it and decided against it. He nods, assumes it's a modesty thing, and goes back to describing the flybridge. He has no idea the number in your accounts is, by this point, larger than his. You don't mention it. Mentioning it was never going to make either of you enjoy the lunch more. Aurelio isn't a bad person, and it would be easy for this comparison to sound like contempt, which isn't the intention. He's doing something almost everyone who's ever had a sudden, significant windfall is quietly encouraged to do. Treating the earnout as permission to finally act on years of deferred wants, all at once, in the specific window when the number feels largest and least real. He wanted the boat, the lake house, the club membership, to arrive at a conclusion about him before anyone had to ask whether any of it was actually built to survive contact with an ordinary year down the road. You've never once needed a marina or a fairway to do that work on your behalf, and it isn't a virtue so much as a byproduct of 14 years spent watching a spreadsheet quietly tell you exactly what every purchase actually costs against what it could otherwise have become. The first purchase almost nobody who's actually wealthy makes is the brand new luxury vehicle bought specifically because it's new rather than because the old one stopped working. Your own sedan, the one with the flickering check engine light, runs fine. It has run fine for 9 years. There is no year in which trading it in for something newer would generate a return, only a cost. And the specific cost, a vehicle that loses roughly 20% of its value the moment it's driven off the lot, is exactly the kind of arithmetic that becomes impossible to unsee once you've spent enough years watching your own portfolio compound in the opposite direction. The second purchase, closely related, is the financed anything, regardless of the asset attached to it. Every rich person who's actually stayed rich for more than a single lucky decade has, at some point, done the specific math on what a loan costs against what the money could otherwise be earning. And the math almost never favors the loan, not when the money is available to simply pay outright and isn't. Aurelio's boat payment isn't really a boat payment. It's a permanent compounding gap between where his portfolio would be and where it now is, extending for as long as the loan does, on an asset that will be worth a fraction of its purchase price by the time the loan's even half paid off. Your own Sunday morning ritual, the same 11 to 18-minute spreadsheet review you've run for over a decade, exists specifically to catch the early signs of this kind of drift before it becomes a pattern. You find one particular Sunday a $12.99 charge for a car wash subscription tied to a vehicle you sold 2 years earlier. The account never fully closed out. You cancel it. $13 means nothing against 8 figures. You cancel it anyway, because the discipline that catches $13 is the exact same discipline that's kept you from ever once financing a depreciating asset in 14 years of having the resources to do so without a second thought. The third purchase is the timeshare, or any of its more sophisticated cousins. The fractional ownership property, the destination club membership, the vacation package sold with the specific urgency of a limited time offer. Your neighbor Marguerite bought into one of these 11 years ago, a fractional share in a resort property that promised, at the time, guaranteed weeks in 3 different locations for a fraction of what full ownership would cost. She's used it 4 times in 11 years. The annual maintenance fees have increased every single year regardless of usage, currently running close to $9,000 annually for weeks she mostly doesn't take, because the specific weeks available to her tier rarely align with when her actual life allows for travel. She's tried to sell her share twice, both times discovering that the resale market for these properties is, by design, close to non-existent, the original purchase price essentially unrecoverable. She mentioned this to you at a neighborhood gathering, with the specific weary humor of someone who's made peace with a mistake she can't undo, joking that the only guaranteed return on the investment was the annual invoice. The fourth purchase, related in spirit, if not in mechanism, is the country club initiation fee paid specifically for the status attached to belonging, rather than for any activity actually enjoyed there. Aurelio's club membership, the one he's used 4 times, cost $85,000 to join and runs another $1,400 a month, regardless of attendance. He describes it, when pressed, as good for the network, a phrase that's covered a great deal of spending across a great many people who've never quite calculated what the network actually costs against what it's produced. You've been invited to join the same club twice over the years, both times by people genuinely trying to do you a favor, and both times you've declined, not because the golf wouldn't be enjoyable, but because you've never once been able to make the arithmetic of the initiation fee work against a decade of alternative uses for the same capital. The fifth purchase is real estate bought on emotion, rather than on a clear-eyed read of the actual return. The vacation home purchased after a single good week somewhere, the investment property bought because a friend mentioned a market was about to take off, the impulse acquisition made during exactly the kind of high that follows a big financial win, when every purchase temporarily feels justified by the size of the number that just landed. Aurelio's Lake House belongs squarely in this category, purchased 11 weeks after the earnout cleared, during a stretch when the entire deal team was still riding the specific euphoria of a successful exit. He toured it once, on a Friday, made an offer that same weekend, and closed within 6 weeks, a timeline that would have felt reckless to him at any other point in his career, and felt, in that particular window, like decisive confidence instead. He uses it 6 weekends a year, The mortgage, the taxes, the maintenance, and the opportunity cost of the capital tied up in it together run close to $95,000 annually, an amount that, invested instead, would have added meaningfully to the compounding he's otherwise built his entire career around protecting. The sixth purchase is the depreciating collection. Watches, art bought for status rather than genuine expertise. Wine cellared without the actual knowledge required to make it appreciate. Cars kept as collections rather than as transportation. There's a version of collecting that's a legitimate, carefully researched asset class. And there's a much more common version that's simply spending dressed up as investing, purchased at retail prices from people whose actual job is convincing collectors that resale value works differently than it typically does. Your own accountant, Priscilla, who's handled the books for a wide range of genuinely wealthy clients over 3 decades, mentions once that she can predict, with unsettling accuracy, which clients will still be wealthy in 20 years based almost entirely on how many of these 6 categories show up on their annual expense report in the years immediately following a major windfall. She says the pattern is remarkably consistent. The clients who buy 0 or 1 of the 6 tend to compound quietly for decades, while the ones who buy 4 or more tend to reappear in her office 10 or 15 years later, needing help untangling a financial picture that looked considerably more solid on paper than it turned out to be in practice. She tells you this over a routine annual meeting, flipping through a folder of your own numbers with the same unhurried, unimpressed thoroughness she's brought to every meeting for the 14 years she's handled your accounts. She's watched Aurelio's file too, in a professional sense, since the two of you shared an accountant for years before he switched to someone he described as more aggressive shortly after the boat purchase. She doesn't say much about the switch beyond a raised eyebrow and a comment that aggressive accountants tend to find ways to make bad decisions look better on paper rather than talking clients out of the decisions in the first place. Your mother calls at 6:40 on a Tuesday evening, an hour that isn't unusual on its own, except for the specific weight in her voice the moment you pick up. Your father's had a fall, an ambulance is already involved, and there is a tightness in her tone that tells you everything before a single detail does. You book the first flight out. It's $980, one way, the kind of last-minute fare that exists specifically to punish people for having emergencies on a Tuesday evening. You do not open the brokerage app first. You do not run the mental math about what the flight costs against anything else. The cost simply doesn't attend the moment. It isn't in the room with you at all, not even as a passing shadow, not even as the ghost of a number you'd have needed to check years earlier, before the discipline of never buying the boat, or the timeshare, or the depreciating collection had a chance to compound into something that could absorb a moment like this one without a flicker of hesitation. This is the truth. Every purchase you've declined over the last 14 years was quietly protecting, and it's the only one that isn't really about restraint at any point. It's about what all those declined boats and financed vehicles and country club initiations were actually for, underneath everything else. Not a bigger number for its own sake, not the private satisfaction of having said no to a marina salesman or a club membership director. It was always, from the very first Sunday spreadsheet over a decade ago, about purchasing the money's own absence from your mind during exactly this kind of moment, so that when your mother's voice tightens on the phone at 6:40 on a Tuesday, your full, unmortgaged attention belongs entirely to your parents, and to nothing else competing for the same 11 seconds. That's the highest job money ever does, and it's the reason the 6 purchases in this list get declined over and over by people who could technically afford every single one of them without blinking. None of those purchases buy this. The boat doesn't buy it. The financed car doesn't buy it. The timeshare, the club membership, the impulse lake house, the collection of watches purchased at retail, none of it purchases the specific, quiet certainty that when the phone rings with bad news, there's nothing standing between you and getting on the next available flight. You land at 11 p.m., your father is stable, a fractured wrist and a scare rather than anything more serious, and your mother meets you at the hospital with a relief in her face that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with you simply being there. She doesn't ask what the flight cost. It never occurs to her to ask, because it's never once occurred to her that cost might be the thing standing between her and her son showing up when it mattered. You fly home 2 days later and the check engine light in your sedan is still flickering, exactly as it's flickered for the better part of a year, still not urgent enough to justify the appointment you keep meaning to make. You drive past the same dealership from that Saturday afternoon on the way home from the airport, the same salesman probably still circling the same loaner vehicle for whoever pulls into the lot next. Money never fixes a Tuesday evening. It never fixed the tightness in your mother's voice before you'd said a single word back to her. And it wouldn't have arrived any faster if you'd bought the boat, the lake house, the club membership. None of those purchases would have made the flight land sooner or the wrist heal faster. Money doesn't undo the things that already occurred. It only decides quietly and years in advance whether the next hard Tuesday costs you a moment of hesitation while you check what you can afford, or costs you nothing at all beyond the actual worry for the person you love. Aurelio calls you a few weeks later, mentioning almost in passing that he's thinking about selling the boat, the maintenance finally outweighing the handful of weekends he's actually used it, the lake house sitting mostly empty most months of the year in a way that started to feel less like enjoyment and more like an obligation he signed himself up for during a stretch when every decision felt smaller than it actually was. You don't say "I told you so," because there was never anything to tell him beyond what he's arriving at on his own, 14 months later, the slow way most people arrive at the actual cost of a decision made during the specific euphoria of a windfall. You still haven't bought the boat, the second home, the club membership, the collection of anything purchased more for what it says than for what it does. Not because you can't, because somewhere in the last decade and a half of Sunday spreadsheets and declined marina tours, the 6 purchases on this list stopped looking like rewards and started looking like exactly what they are: a trade against the one mechanism that actually built the number people spend those purchases trying to celebrate. Priscilla's prediction about Aurelio turns out to be roughly right, though it takes a few more years to fully play out. He sells the boat within the year, the lake house not long after, the club membership lapsing quietly once he stops renewing it, and nobody at the club particularly notices. He tells you, over a much simpler lunch than the one from 14 months earlier, that he's started his own version of a Sunday review now, embarrassed to admit he's essentially copying a habit he used to gently tease you for having. You tell him there's nothing to be embarrassed about. Most people arrive at the same 6-item list eventually. Some just arrive at it a few $100,000 later than others. And now that so little of your life has ever been reorganized around any of them, now that the sedan still runs and the flight always books itself the moment it's needed and nothing about your actual days has changed in 14 months, despite the number behind them changing considerably, what would any of those 6 purchases have actually bought you that the absence of buying them hasn't already quietly provided instead?